Hi everyone, I'm Luana Grant and welcome to Media Ring Yarning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all gathering today and pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging from my people, the Wiradjuri and Arrernte people. I would also like to acknowledge and honour the 432 Indigenous Australians who have died in custody since 1991 and stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the US. So this week we are joined by Catherine Liddell. Catherine is the CEO of First Nations Media Australia and also the chair of Media Ring. First of all, thank you so much for your time today, Catherine.
Thank you, Luana.
So just quickly, as an introduction for the viewers out there, tell us about your journey in media and how you got to where you are today.
My journey in media. Oh, you know what? It goes for a really long time, which I think is symptomatic of my age. So look, essentially, I'm a product of the 70s, and the 70s I guess globally, not only from an Aboriginal perspective, but globally was a time of great change. It's a time when people were storming offices, and it's a time when things like the SBS where you're working were formed. And there's a reason for that. That's because people were acknowledging there was a different way of doing things. And at that period of time, there was a huge acknowledgement that there needed to be a different way to get Aboriginal perspectives across, and there was a different and what we would see, the images and stories that were being reflected in media were not reflections of us, and were often framed in a way that didn't portray us very well. And don't get me wrong, I know some of that exists today, but if you were to compare it to what existed in the 70s, it is absolutely incomparable.
Mm-hmm.
So really, I grew up listening to those stories about how these things, how we needed to not only be better portrayed in media, but to be able to do that, we needed to own it, we needed to manage it, we needed to work in it. We needed to set the agenda. And so as a result of that, I grew up sitting at the feet of people who were lobbying for great institutions like Karma Radio, which was an absolute pioneer in its space, and immediately changed the way we were able to see ourselves and celebrate this incredible culture that we had, and this incredible history that we had, but also enable us to see ourselves. And that just was a game changer, to turn on the radio and hear your uncles and aunties talking to you. And again, we're probably hitting about the 80s now. So at that period of time, I would have been living out at a little community called Wallace Rockall. And for those of you who don't know what an outstation is, they're like little stations outside small communities in the Northern Territory. And you live with all your cousins and your uncles and your aunties, and you go to school half the day, which was awesome, by the way. But there are other things to it. It also meant that in those days in the outstations, there was only a kitchen and then a whole heap of like little tin sheds or brick houses, and those brick houses only had a sink and a power point. That was all that was in them. So the bathrooms were shared. The bathroom was shared. Let me be very clear on that. And while it was a fantastic environment as a child to grow up in, because you're always surrounded by your family and friends, it was also sort of isolating. And one of the things that we started noticing when the workers started to come in and build actual houses, and I mean actual houses with bathrooms and kitchens and bedrooms, was that they were playing radio. And we knew that this radio existed because, we knew that people were working at it at Undaria, but the only radio station they could connect to was Karma. So that was fantastic. And it was our uncle, Warren Williams, who was on the radio, and he was the DJ. So it also meant that when we went to Undari, and this was a big deal to go to Undari for supplies, we could jump into the yellow Toyota and then jump off the yellow Toyota and run into the Brax facility and go and see Uncle Warren, who would immediately put our voices on radio. So, you'd be there, "Hey, my name's Catherine Liddell, I'm from..." So we knew it was ours, I
Yeah.
knew media was possible. So I always had it in the back of my head that this was something that I'd like to be involved with, and I'd like to be like Uncle Warren one day. And as the world evolves, that happened to be an opportunity for me, and it was an opportunity only because in Alice Springs we had not only Karma but Impaja, and
Right.
uh, and that was as simple at that point in time. Well, I say it's simple, it wasn't really, of writing a letter and saying, I'm someone you want to have a look at, come and let me have a chat. And luckily for me, Owen Cole at the time said, you know what, there's a job answering telephones, you can come in and answer a few telephones. Grew from there.
So that's where it all began.
It is.
So just switching gears, this week has been an extremely and an incredibly tough and difficult time, as an Indigenous person. How are you personally dealing with the past week and a half?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? We're coming out of Reconciliation Week, and I always do a lot of thinking around Reconciliation Week because that's the whole purpose of that point in time. And I'd been thinking about, well, what does reconciliation mean, and what does the title of the week, the theme of the week, we're all in this together, mean? And to me, it was a week that was supposed to celebrate acknowledging a past and acknowledging some barriers, but also acknowledging that there is an incredible number of people in Australia who really want to join with Aboriginal people and I guess heal some of the wounds and work out how we solve a few of the problems that we're dealing with going into the future, and how do we create a more equitable society. And then off the back of that, obviously, we see what happened in the United States with the death of Mr. Floyd, and that sort of it's really hard to frame, but it's sort of like when something like that happens as an Indigenous person, um, a whole heap of vulnerabilities bubble up to the surface, and they're vulnerabilities that you know they're there, they're always here, but for whatever reason, when every time you see a level of trauma associated with an act of what is racism, you it all comes back up again. And I'll give you an example of how I frame that. I was dropping the kids off at the gym because my children apparently need to work out at 9 o'clock at night. And on the way back from the gym, there's an intersection, and at that intersection is a cross. And I drive that route every day, at least once a day. And on this particular day, that cross was more pertinent to me. And it's there in my life every day because that cross symbolizes where a young cousin of mine was killed by a drunk driver. And, but for whatever reason, on this particular day, because of that event, you're more cognizant of all those other things that bubble along under the surface and frame your life as an Indigenous person. So I see that, and then the next thing I see is I go around the corner and um, there's another cross, and this cross belongs to an uncle of mine, Mr. Ryder, and he was murdered. And you look at that and you go, okay, why am I more conscious of that today than ever? And then you go
Yeah.
around the corner again, and you see there's this spot that marks where one of my young cousin sisters was raped and murdered by several men, and you go, yep, okay, this is more present. And like I said, these things are present every single day, but because of what you're seeing on the television, because of the conversations you're hearing on the television, those traumas come bumbling up again, and
Yeah, like it triggers you.
it does. And when I talk about what happened to my little sister, you think about things like when she was missing. I was a journalist, and the calls were coming through that a young black girl had gone walkabout. And we said, who's the young black girl? And they said her name. And well, she doesn't go and walkabout. She's my sister. I know exactly who she is. She's missing.
Yeah.
And when the coroner's report came through, it didn't find that she'd been raped and murdered because she weighed 90 kilograms. And therefore, the only way 9 people could have sex with her would be if she chose to do it voluntarily. So those sorts of things come bubbling to the surface because we know about them. And then you
Mhm.
start connecting them to the black deaths in custody that happened here. So you start feeling this enormous amount of empathy for what those mob in the United States are dealing with, but also what our mob on the ground here are dealing with, because we do know that there have been more than 400 deaths in custody since the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody. And we do know that whenever this happens, our people are just traumatized, because we're not talking about someone in the United States when we're talking about it. We're talking about our family members. We're talking about our brothers and our sisters and our daughters and our mothers. So we feel this incredible vulnerability. And as an Aboriginal person, I feel vulnerable. I guess that is the only word I can come back to. I feel vulnerable and I feel challenged. And I look at the media and I think it's awesome to see some incredible demonstrations of where people are seeing what's happening. But then I also see these breakout conversations that start reframing it away from racism and saying, well, get over yourselves. It's, what was he doing to deserve this? And what we know as Aboriginal people who deal with this is often you're not doing anything to deserve this. How does anyone deserve to die while being arrested?
Yeah, totally. It's been a really hard time, and I know for myself, just watching the news coverage, and it does trigger a lot of different emotions, and it's very triggering and difficult time for those working in Indigenous media and also reporting on trauma. Today, there is a webinar hosted by FNMA about supporting journalists and the impact on communities. Can you discuss this and what other plans FNMA has to support at this time?
Absolutely. So, when you talk about, if I go back to the theme of reconciliation, as week, we're all in this together. The truth is, like I was saying, when First Nations media report this and report incidences like this, it's not a one-off. So what we're looking at the extraordinary moment in time we're facing, it's the tip of the iceberg. But for us, it's an everyday thing. We're constantly reporting about issues relating to this, and they are our family members. They're our, this hurts. This really, really hurts. So what we're aware of is that in reporting that, there's some huge responsibilities to make sure that we're putting out a discourse that resonates with the rest of the world, because unless we can find a way to humanize this, people do have struggle with understanding why it is that people become so distressed and so angry. So we've got to find that human connection while still telling the truth. And what we know about telling the truth is it's hard to do because it challenges people and it can make people feel uncomfortable, and that in itself can potentially lose some of the people we need as allies. And what we want to do is bring in those allies. But it certainly gives a little bit of fire to those people who don't really get it either, and that can cause more harm than good. We also know that when we report on situations like this, all those things we're talking about, feeling vulnerable about, well, everyone listening to us, everyone watching us, they're dealing with exactly the same issues. So how do we ensure that we're having those rigorous conversations, being honest, telling the truth, challenging perspectives, while still protecting our mob at home? Because these aren't statistics. These are our family members. These are our community members. So there's a huge responsibility for our media tellers to make sure they get the story right, but they also protect themselves and they also protect the communities, and they find a way to connect with their audiences and the broader audiences so that they understand what's happening at this moment in time and can walk with us as we try and, I guess, find a way out of it that is respectful and potentially meaningful as well.
So reports on the news and current affairs from First Nations perspective is so vital, and I guess even more so at this time. What would your advice be for media practitioners and in particular journalists covering traumatic content?
I guess it would be, it's really easy. Go and find the First Nations perspective. And I understand that sometimes that's challenging to do. Where do we find it? Well, there are, 17 different radio stations. There's another 8 remote media stations. There's NITV, there's Koori Mail, there's NERS. There's many, many Aboriginal organisations that you can potentially reach out to and have a listen to or watch and see what's different about what they're framing and how they're framing the conversation. Because often perspective is the storyteller. It's like, when people talk about how I guess, war stories are told, it will look different from who's telling the story, and certainly the winners always tell it differently. So there's something really critical in understanding how you frame it. And I think if I move it back to an earlier incident, and in this case I'll talk about Adam Goods, and I was in a room recently where they put up some images of that period of time when a lot of people weren't necessarily understanding what it was they were seeing on their screens or hearing on their radios or reading on online platforms, or even our beautiful print media. And in this room, it's the documentary that Stan did, your dad. So, I always feel a bit connected to that.
Yeah.
And up it comes, and there's this there's the image of Adam throwing his boomerang, and then it cuts to the crowd, and there's the booing and blah blah blah, and all that sort of commotion, and then it cuts to a couple of panel shows where people are talking about how disgraceful the actions were. They're all non-Indigenous people, by the way, and how terrible it is, and what a blight on the industry it is. And then it cuts to images of a press conference where they're talking to Adam about what's happened, and they ask the question and they say, "Oh well, Eddie said this, and what do you think about that?" And Adam is just so poised in his responses, and he's saying, "Oh well, he's been quite reasonable." But what's not reasonable is how the media pack is responding to that. They're tearing him apart. They're throwing these questions at him that you just, as an Aboriginal person, your head is exploding, and you're saying, at this moment in time, where was the Chief of Staff to say to its reporters, that is not the story. The story is, why are we getting reactions like this? The story is, how did it feel when you did that? Did you get any feedback from your community members about what it felt like in the Indigenous round to see that? And again, when I think about what was happening in the panel show, no Aboriginal commentators in there, no one with any perspective to reframe it and say, well, hang on, maybe the issue we're having right now is the conversation that's happening around it and what avenues that are taking. Because as media practitioners, we are the influencers. We are guiding people's perspectives. We are the ones understanding how to generate emotion. And let's be honest, as a media practitioner, we know how to get people to respond. Sometimes, though, that's challenging, and it's really challenging if you don't have that perspective. So I'll take it back one more layer, and I'll talk about when the images that we were looking at in that particular video, when Adam throws the boomerang, and the studio director has cut to a shot of people booing, and that's all you see. But I bet my bottom dollar that there were hundreds of people in that crowd also cheering with this incredible pride on their faces, going, look what we just saw, look what we just saw. Completely missing what would it have looked like, and how would we have responded as a community if we'd seen that level of pride. Much like when you see, say, for example, if I move it to sport again, and it's Greg Inglis when he does his goanna. I've been in rooms of people when he does the goanna, and every kid on the floor, whether they're Indigenous or not Indigenous, copies the goanna. And that's because the studio director directs that frame. So there's this incredible responsibility of media to look at all perspectives, not just the perspectives that potentially are an easy sell. Where is your gift as a producer? Where is your gift as a journalist in understanding how to sell the harder points and how to humanize things that people are not used to connecting to?
And I know you just touched on, panel shows and things like that. And I know I've been watching this week in particular, a lot of morning shows, and, they have majority of it been filled with, non-Indigenous voices. And, in the mainstream media, comments made that reflect ignorance about Indigenous Australia's history and also conflict with police. What is the role of media at this current time, and how do you think we can work more inclusively?
It has an incredible responsibility towards truth telling, and again, I noticed you used the words ignorance about what's happened, and well, where does that? And ignorance is a challenging word, right? It's like white supremacy, all those sorts of words. These words are really hard to hear, and even as a non-Indigenous, as an Indigenous person, sorry, when I hear them, I sort of go like this because they're really confrontational. So
Mm.
you've got to look behind what the words say and understand what they mean. And I guess any of you that are managers that would be listening into that, it's like, you know, if you're having a problem with a staff member and they're cross and they're distressed, listening to what they're actually saying and what is actually happening at the moment, and understanding that what's happening at the moment is genuinely the tip of the iceberg. You have to unpack it. You have to look at the layers of trauma. You have to look at this consistent history of these things happening over and over and over again. And where does the blame go? The blame usually goes to the victim instead of to all the things and all the strings that have tied together to create this knot that we can't get out of. So as media professionals, that's getting those voices on that are able to articulate what's happening, to describe why we're reacting the way we do as a community, because there's significant research in all of this. The universities are filled with them, and there's incredibly charismatic people out here that can unpack this so that you understand why, as a nation, sometimes this stuff is hard to reconcile, and why sometimes members of the public react in a way that's a bit visceral and in a way that blocks connecting to the moment. And also understanding, again, getting back to the gift of storytellers, find the humanisation element in this. We're talking, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in Australia, we are talking about people's family members. So it is a real gift to understand how to bring that to the screen, particularly when people are distressed.
Yeah. You know, racism exists in this country, and we are, you know, at the end of Reconciliation Week, as you mentioned, and the theme was In This Together. And with the current situation with the death of African-American man George Floyd, and what we are also seeing, you know, back home with our own Aboriginal brothers and sisters gathering in solidarity around the country, how can we all come together as a nation to confront and tackle these issues so that we can have some positive outcomes for our people and also justice for the families that have been affected by deaths in custody?
It's a long game, right? This is what we're looking at now is a moment in time. So if you're looking at the protests and you find them confronting, again, step back and understand, and I guess try to find whatever it is that makes you resonate with why people might want to do that, and have a look, listen to the stories. You know, reach out to Aboriginal media, take a
Mm.
look. NITV, take a listen to Koori Radio, whatever it is, whatever station it is, have a listen to the difference in the voices and what they're saying so that you can understand why people might be doing it, and then see where you might fit in, I guess, changing the dialogue, because that's what's got to happen. The dialogue has to change. Our perspective and our framing has to change. And I guess it's about keeping it on the radar all the time. So, you know, do we need inclusion all the time? Absolutely. And I guess that gets us back to, you know, what Media Ring is. That's the whole point of organisations like entities, like Media Ring, is to find a way to be a more inclusive media sector by bringing those perspectives back in. So think differently about, you know, who you might be employing or where you might be able to reach out for really interesting content. And I guess I'm not quite sure how it correlates, but clearly something in my brain is telling me this connects to that. I had a conversation recently with someone who wanted to do a story with one of our members, and they were looking for a light, fluffy story relating to COVID. And you know, what sort of content have your members been making? And I said, well, our members are incredibly creative, but they create content that is specific for their community, so that it's their voices, their perspectives, all of those things I'm talking about. And I sent through a couple of examples, and the person rings back and says, oh, look, we really want to do it. This is going to be a lovely, fluffy piece to end the week on. And I said to them at that point in time, listen, I know I understand what you're saying right now about this being a really fluffy piece, but in actual fact, it's not. It's really, really serious. And every single issue that is affecting non-Indigenous people is affecting us as part of COVID. Every single message that the government is putting out is embedded into the way into the messages that our members are putting out. And I said, moreover, we are the most vulnerable population in Australia. And if it gets into our communities, we are in serious trouble, because we do not have the health behind us that will get us out of it if it gets into our communities. So It's understanding things like that. It's understanding that just because people might be dealing with challenges differently doesn't mean that those challenges aren't really serious. It doesn't mean that they're not really valid. And so look at framing it differently. Look at what the long game is. Look at how you keep elements of truth telling as part of your dialogue all the time, and look past what that means, because truth telling is a funny thing, isn't it? I mean, what does that mean? It means understanding that, getting back to your earlier thing about ignorance, is if Australia is ignorant, it's because the truth wasn't told. And that's been
100%.
proven over and over again, that the
Mm,
truth about what happened in Australia is not something that's part of our everyday rhetoric, and it has
mhm.
shaped us as a country.
Yeah, it's interesting that you touch on, truth telling. I think on a whole, do you think the media coverage has been fair, of the George Floyd situation, and also this week with the coverage and reporting on the teenage boy who was slammed to the ground by a police officer in Sydney? What do you think about, the media coverage and, as you were touching on, truth telling as well?
I think there have been some fantastic examples of how media has covered the events of the last week. Um, I think there's also been some really disappointing ones, and certainly from publications that I thought better of, to be perfectly honest. And
Mm,
um, you know, we're seeing people reframe um, our mob as activists. And again, you reframe someone as an activist, automatically people go, as
yeah.
opposed to, you're an activist because you're speaking up about something. Probably, it's inflammatory language, right? So we are seeing an emergence of inflammatory language. Certainly, we are seeing that there is a level of biasness in the reporting, in a lot of the reporting. Whether that is deliberate or unconscious, I don't know, but I'd say unconscious bias has a lot to do with it. Whether or not it's because we haven't tried hard enough to go and get the black perspectives into these comments,
Mhm.
is probably a lot of it. And again, like I was saying earlier, reach out to your First Nations media providers. If you can't find them, listen to who they're using, or
Mm,
get one of them on to give you a different perspective of what's actually happening.
yeah.
So but I do think we are seeing something a little, we've seen this incredible convergence of people wanting to support, but certainly those voices around the edges that don't quite get this, and they're angry in a different way, are gaining momentum again. And so there is a responsibility of the media to make sure that while you're putting up both perspectives, you're actually, as media influencers and as media representatives, not giving too much noise to the wrong part of the story, that
Mhm.
you're not putting the wrong perspective as the right perspective and the giant perspective.
Yeah, I saw on, and I can't remember what day it was, but on the project they had Nakia Louie, and they dedicated their whole show to talking about these issues and, talking about what happened in America and, the correlations and how that is also reflected here in Australia. So that made me, really, I was really proud of Nakia and how she, stood up and she spoke, and they were very respectful and they wanted to listen. So I thought, that was really nice to see, her involved in that show. And also on Tuesday night, we saw social media went black with thousands of people posting black squares to show solidarity for the recent protests against police brutality in the US and here in Australia. What are more practical ways people can support, and drive actual change in this country, do you think?
Going back, all right, go back. I think that that very it's one of those social media posts that's gone viral, of that
Mm.
it's an
Keeps it
African.
like everyone, every time I go on Instagram, people are posting the black squares, and I think, it does show that there is support, but are those people going to be there, on Jan 26, protesting and marching with us?
Yep,
But
and
like,
that's
what more can people do?
That's right, and that's the long game. So it is. It's
Yeah.
it's going back, and it's understanding the history, and it's understanding, I guess, how we got to where we are, and understanding that things like if we go back to the arrest of the young man, the teenager in New South Wales,
Mm,
that incident is not isolated. It happens all the time, and understanding that people, like, if you are in the US, and if I was living in the US, and I had my children, my boys in particular, driving cars or running down the street, I think I'd be a little bit worried about that. Um,
Mm,
and when I say think, that's me speaking as an Aboriginal people person. That's how we speak.
yeah.
What I actually mean is I would be worried. I would be scared. And I know this because I'm an Aboriginal woman who lives in Alice Springs, and I have Aboriginal family, and I have 3 Aboriginal sons, and they hang out with Aboriginal people. And I know that before they got cars, and they'd ride around on bikes and they'd turn up at 11 o'clock at night, Mum, 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 we need food. And I'd say, what are you doing? And they'd say, we've just been riding here and we're riding there, and there was a dog and there was a car and blah, blah, blah. And I'd say to them, be really, really, really careful, because you're 3 black boys sitting on
Mm,
really flash bikes, and it is not uncommon for you to be pulled over because you're riding on a flash bike, and for things to go very wrong very, very quickly because you're teenagers, and
yeah,
teenagers
100%. I can,
best responses.
yeah, like I can relate to that. My brothers have, like your boys, have faced things like that, being, questioned just for, walking around, or, my brother was asked, where did you get that gold necklace? And he's questioned by police. And it's just, like you said, this time at the moment is so triggering. And it's hard.
It is, and our young people are seeing these images, right? Every time they see these images, and it reinforces, I guess, that level of pain, and it makes you more agitated. It puts you on
Mm,
edge. So that's why things like the black squares are so incredibly important, because that's another image to share with people, to say, look, we are there. We understand this. We have some solidarity. The messages that are going out on television, saying we support the Black Lives Matter campaign. We understand the Black Lives Matter campaign. When you see them, they give you a bit of hope, right? They make you
yeah.
feel a bit secure. But as you said, how does that keep going? It's a long game. So it's looking as a media professional, can you program a series of conversations over the course of the year that
Mhm,
keep this on the agenda, but more importantly, reframe it from an Indigenous perspective, that is celebratory, and that shows resilience and shows strength, but also explores that pain. Look at things like our suicide rates. They're incomprehensible, the number of our family members that die from suicide, and it happens like that. I
mm,
certainly know, my son's best friend, we lost him at the beginning of last year, and he was the second in that group of friends. These are not statistics; these are
mm.
our boys, and it
It's
happened.
heartbreaking.
So it's understanding that just doesn't come out of the blue.
Mm.
Something is seriously wrong in our communities when these things happen. So how can you be part of that? You keep it on the agenda, and you keep it on an agenda that says, we want to work with you. We want to understand what's happening. We see you as full human beings, as global citizens, and we want to be participating in your journeys with you. And we want to understand where the barriers come from. We want to understand what our role is in removing those barriers, and we want to walk alongside you. And we understand sometimes we're going to get it wrong, but we're going to try.
And what do you think Media Ring, as an organisation, can do to support the industry?
I think we're a conduit. Things like conversations like this. They're an opportunity for people to be able to reach out. They're an opportunity for people to be to learn, but I guess more importantly, anyone involved with Media Ring obviously has already made a commitment to change and
Mhm,
is looking for a different way of doing business. So be open in what that business could look like. I know it could be simplified into just saying, here's a job. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. What else feeds into that job? What else can you do as an agency that changes the world around you? How do you change the perspectives of all layers of your business? Because it's not as simple as just one job, even though one job would be absolutely fantastic and I'd celebrate you for it. So, reach out to Media Ring and say, we're struggling with this bit of business. Is there
mm.
someone there, or can you help us with it? Or can you put us into contact with someone? Reach out to your media and Aboriginal media organisations as well if you need to. If you're having trouble, well, maybe use an organisation like ours, an entity like ours.
And I guess, how are you coping as CEO of FNMA with the effects of COVID and I guess the impacts the current climate has had on the media industry, and also your personal thoughts around the impacts it's had on community?
Mm. COVID has been a moment in time, hasn't it? It's been an incredible moment in time. I think initially our thoughts were very much centred on the fact that the projections for the Aboriginal community, if it got into our communities, were devastating. So one of the projections that was touted here in the Northern Territory is that if it got into our communities, we would lose 2,400 people within 3 months.
Mm.
That hasn't happened, and
Yeah.
our media has played a significant role in being
Mm.
able to effectively message the behaviours that are needed to help at this point in time.
Mm.
Um, so there was this incredible, I guess, need to get out in front of the sector and say, what do you need right now? This is coming, and you're going to be absolutely pivotal in effective messaging for your communities, whilst understanding that the money to help with this messaging wasn't coming into our sector; it was going into every other sector. Um, and you sort of get that. But as First Nations Media Australia, we had to come out really strong and say, listen, you have to. Our organisations are the most responsive, they are the most flexible, and they are the only ones that speak directly to their communities. And for most Aboriginal communities, we are the primary source of information. So it was about trying to get more eyes from all layers of government onto our sector. It was about then collecting all the work of our sector and pushing it out as much as we could to all those jurisdictional levels of government and the Commonwealth, and making sure that they had avenues, even potentially to share those with the minister, so they could see the nuances. What is the difference of messaging that comes from us? It was also about getting out in front of our sector so that they had the resources that they needed to understand what effective policy looked like during that time. How did you manage it? You know, what does it mean for your finances? How many team members might you lose during this period of time? Can you access JobKeeper? So we've tried to get bits of information out and webinars out that really support people to be able to get through this period of time. And in many ways, it has set the scene for how we're responding to this particular point in time, as well as, you know, getting someone like Stan in to talk about the impacts of reporting on trauma and the responsibilities to community at this time. So it's been, it's been a lot of work. It's meant that we've had to transform the way we did business, and it means we've had to transform very, very quickly. But where there's a cloud, there's a silver lining, and I think that's what I'm taking out of this for both us and for our members. Is it has the point in time where we have absolutely been able to demonstrate what is different about our sector, how fast we can respond, how creative we are, and how resilient we are. So the next piece of work coming in that will be about us advocating and leading that space, and making sure people understand that there is a nuance here and it is absolutely vital.
Hmm. And what advice would you give to, young blackfellow producers that want to get their content greenlit?
Mm. You've got to find what's different. Okay, that is the real secret of it, is finding that bit that's different. So what I know is there's something about the world. When you have a thought, everybody else in the world has that thought. I don't know how it works. So if you're pitching a story, there's a really good chance there's 5 or 10 different people
The same
pitching.
idea.
Yeah, so what is it about your nuance that's different? And that is the humanisation element. What is it that's going to get someone in? Is it having that star quality? Is it having an incredible presenter? Is it finding something that's different? Those sorts of things. But when you're thinking about what they are, look at what's resonating. You don't actually just come up with a good idea and it's going to work. You have to look at what the industry is doing. How is the industry changing? If it's telling you that reality television is rating, well, how does that impact on you? If it's telling you that it's no longer good enough to make content and expect people to come and watch it, you have to think about what the other layers are. So how do I drive people to this content? How do people, I guess, in going back to what you were saying before, how do people watch this content and then keep it moving? What are the next pieces of the puzzle? So, for example, like what we're talking about now, how do we keep people in the moment of time so that it's an ongoing thing? Well, maybe it's not just what you're putting on your screens or on your radio, it's the next piece of the puzzle. Want to read more? Go to this link. Want to see more? Go to this link. Want to hear more? You can hear it here.
Yeah.
So any pitch has to be three-dimensional. It's no longer good enough to be one-dimensional, and it has to find a way to get through to. It needs to find a way to find people, because people aren't going to find it anymore. So it's finding those nuances. It's about pitching and being brave in those pitches, listening to feedback. So don't take rejection as rejection. It's about going, okay, I heard what you said. I'm going to reframe it and come back again. And don't be afraid to pitch the same thing. While I've said be different, don't ever be afraid to repitch it again, because sometimes it was just the moment in time, or sometimes finding the right avenue.
And have a thick skin.
have a very, very thick skin, absolutely. And
I've definitely learnt that over the years.
Absolutely. So it's about being creative. It's about being bold. It's about trying and having fun. Absolutely having fun.
So I guess in closing, Catherine, what does the future hold for you?
What does the future hold for me?
Big question.
Yeah, because the truth of it is, I am a temperamental creative at heart. While I'm sitting in an administrative position, it is always very, very hard for me to stay still, because I like being creative. I like being challenged. I like seeing what's next. So I am having a fantastic time and acknowledge this incredible opportunity that my peers have given me in letting me lead our national representative body. What an awesome opportunity. But what will I be doing next? I think what I'm doing is making sure that I'm working with my team members to make sure that we're absolutely in front of our sector, that we're building the processes that make us a robust organisation. And the reason I'm doing those would be because I'm an itchy foot, and I will potentially be looking at what comes next for me. I just don't know what that is. I think I am a person who, like what I said, what you do with young producers is I do look for what the next opportunity is for me. No idea what that is, but I suspect if I keep my eyes open, I'll see it when it comes. But for now, I'm having a fantastic time and feeling really proud of the work that our members do and the work our team does.
Well, it's great. And I really appreciate your time, Catherine, and speaking about these tough issues and your personal insights. We're definitely facing a really tough time, but, hopefully we can all come together and we can see some, practical change, and, hopefully it doesn't end here and the conversations continue, so that, we see some justice and, see some change within the media sector. So that's all we have time for today. Please take care, and we'll see you next week.